Before we dive into today's episode, we've got something special to share with all of you. We're proud to announce the launch of Wild Roots, a brand new film series from Wolf Connection and the Wolf Connection podcast. This series takes the stories, lessons, and connection we've experienced with the wolves at our sanctuary out into the wider world, exploring what it truly means to reconnect with nature and the wilds. The first installment is called A Handful of Dirt, featuring John Potter. If you want to be a part of this journey, you'll need to sign up to get early access to each film as it's released. Stay tuned to the Wolf Connection and Wolf Connection podcast socials for when the trailer drops and the link information on where you need to go to sign up. And make sure you're following along. This is just the beginning.
The land, the animals, and the people. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast.
Our guest coming to us today, when this is being recorded, when we've seen obviously major shifts in temperature across the American West, from California through Colorado, and obviously wildfires breaking out in Nebraska, and really a good time to have this individual on. He's a fifth-generation Coloradan, big game hunter, but also works in the clean energy space for quite some time. His name is Eric Washburn. Eric, it's wonderful to finally meet you and to put some of those words that I've been reading with a face. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing well, John, and I appreciate the chance to come on your show and talk about, one of our favorite mutual species, the gray wolf.
Yeah, no, the wolves are great, and they are the pillar of everything that we do here. But boy, it's really opened up such a huge plethora of other topics as we have navigated through this podcast over the years. And you really can touch on a lot of those things. It's great that you're in sort of so many different areas. But before we jump into everything, because we do have a lot of topics, just tell everybody a little bit about your background. Describe your connection to the environment, because I think it's so valuable to speak with someone who his family has been in Colorado for as long as it's been, and you're also a hunter and you're a conservationist. So you have all these different touch points. So just give everybody a little bit of background on yourself.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, my family came across from Missouri in the 1870s after the Civil War, looking for work, and became silver miners down in the San Juans in the southwestern part of the state. I grew up here off and on for the most part, Denver, Aurora, and then a couple of years up near Steamboat Springs, which is where I live now. And my parents got divorced when I was 6, and my mom was raising 3 boys in Aurora, Colorado, outside of Denver. And we had no money, but she saved throughout the year to take us for a week every year to the YMCA camp in Estes Park, and taught us to fish, horseback ride, that kind of thing. And I think that was the first, I was like 7, 8 years old. That was the first time I really got excited about the environment. But then growing up in Colorado, you're just around it. You love eagles, elk, deer, whatever. You see it a lot. You want to see it more. Fishing. I didn't grow up hunting. I didn't start that until I was in my 30s. But my mom made sure we got a big dose of the outdoors, and that really formed, our character and interest.
I mean, talk about that switch, because it's so great that you guys were able to have that even with a single parent. And look, my family got divorced, or my parents got divorced as well, and they do the best they can with raising their kids. How important was it for your mom to really instill those values about having a relationship with the environment and being outdoors and appreciating those things that many of us who grow up in urban centers or in places where we have concrete jungles as opposed to the wildlife and the grass around us? Why was that so instilled in her to make sure you guys felt that and had those growing up?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think my mom, she grew up in Denver, but at the time she grew up in Denver, it was a tiny little town, a couple 100,000 people. And she spent tons of time in nature around Colorado. We had relatives who lived in the mountains. Her grandfather had been a silver miner, in tough conditions, these mining towns that no longer exist today. But I think she herself felt a great connection to nature. And I think without a father, I think she felt like nature kind of substituted for that. And it gave us things to do. It gave us, we fished and we hiked and we rode, horseback riding at the YMCA camp. And it was just a really wholesome way to grow up. And I think that's what she wanted for us.
When you transitioned to going from that and into your 30s, starting to hunt, and I would imagine it's sustenance hunting, things like that. What were any traditions or any sort of ethics that you took from maybe your younger years as you moved into hunting? And I think you were writing in some of your articles, you hunt elk, and I believe you hunt deer as well. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, but what are some of the things you carried over from your younger childhood into your practices as a big game hunter?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, the reason I started hunting in my 30s, I was working in Washington, D.C. for a U.S. Senator from South Dakota, a guy named Tom Daschle. And I was spending a lot of time back in South Dakota, working, in fact, a lot with the state wildlife agency, working on legislation with them, getting them money, getting them land to do more conservation work. And it was just being around those guys, and they were big hunters. Everyone who worked for the South Dakota Game Fish and Park seemed to hunt. And so I just got really curious about it, because I'd grown up fishing but not hunting. And they kind of took me under their wing, and they took me out, and we shot ducks and we shot pheasants, and eventually, deer and pronghorn, and I just became addicted to it. It was like heroin for me. It was great.
So when people, obviously we've hit this, I think, this point or this flashpoint somewhere in our society where everything is basically divided or divisive on some level. And I'm sure, I mean, look, we try to talk to all sides here, and we've done that, I think, fairly well on this podcast. What would you say to the non-consumptive community that's listening to you talk about hunting and things like that, and how there is an ethic, at least speak for yourself, I guess, about that ethic and what it means to be out in the environment, be out in nature, and see all these things sort of working together, and bringing that back to the practice of hunting and what it means for you, and carrying that forward, I guess.
Yeah. So I'm kind of an introverted guy, and I'm kind of a bookworm. So I spent a lot of time reading about like Theodore Roosevelt and George Bird Grinnell and what happened in the late 1800s when market hunters were decimating, America's wildlife, and when they came in and, set up the public land system, created the North American model for wildlife conservation, the fair chase ethic. And I was just kind of fascinated by not only the history of all that, but then, kind of putting into practice myself. And I was hunting with guys from South Dakota Game Fish and Parks who were very ethical. They were all about let's regulate it in a responsible, rational way. And so I think all of that kind of built up in me this ethical framework of this is how you're supposed to treat nature. Consider it a privilege to hunt, but make sure the ecosystem is healthy too, because that's what supports big game hunting and all the species that depend on those ecosystems.
When you talk about that too, and obviously it goes into predator conservation as well, because there's always obviously been this push-pull, and as we're sort of getting into the topics and stuff that I sent you, for you, what was it like back then in your 30s as opposed to now where you are almost 3 decades later, surrounding, I guess, the predator conversation as you got into those hunting circles? Was it, the same as you spoke about with recognizing the ecosystem balance? There may be things that are sort of out of whack. How did those things trickle into your hemisphere as a young man, and as you've seen it sort of evolve or change over time? Briefly, if you can.
Yeah, and I've sort of evolved over time. I mean, I think from my mid-30s to probably when I was like 50 or so, I was really just an enthusiastic hunter. I thought about the historical connection, but I didn't think too deeply about the ecological connections. And then it was really, I'm an inveterate elk hunter. I love to hunt elk every year. It's a big passion of mine. And I was hunting elk up by the Wyoming border in Colorado back in 2016. And I shot an elk way up high, up about 11,000 feet. And I was packing the quarters back down to camp, which was in the valley, probably at like 10,000 or 9,000 feet. And I got down there, and I turned around for some reason, and I looked back, and in this big beige field was a black wolf. In 2016, right? We hadn't, long before we'd ever had the ballot initiative here. And I just thought, well, that was cool, and it sat there for like 4 or 5 minutes, smelling the air, because it could smell the elk that was on my pack. And then just kind of wandered back into the woods. But it kind of got me thinking, like, why don't we have more wolves here? Like, what's wrong with this ecosystem that it doesn't support wolves? And then I started to research that more and realized that we killed them all back in the 40s. because of livestock and so forth. And while we have wolves now in the northern Rockies, it's almost impossible for them to get through Wyoming down to Colorado because they shoot wolves in Wyoming on site, 365 days a year. So it just kind of piqued my interest. And then about 2 years later, I was hunting mule deer up not too far from there, just west of there. And I shot a big, beautiful mule deer buck. And I took it back to Steamboat where I live. And I took it into the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Office because they wanted the head, to test for chronic wasting disease. So I took it in, and they sent me an email back 2 weeks later saying it had tested positive for chronic wasting disease, and throw all your meat in the garbage because you're not supposed to eat that. So I followed their rules. I did that, but it really discouraged me, and I thought, why do we have chronic wasting disease for the first time ever, probably in North America? And I just did more and more research and kind of put two and two together. And I'm not the first one to figure this out, but wolves, mountain lions, predators like that are kind of nature's way of cleansing disease out of these ecosystems. Because what they do is they kill diseased prey, diseased individuals. Those are the ones they prefer because they're easier to kill. And so when we killed the last wolves in Colorado in 1940, we kind of opened the door to the epidemic of chronic wasting disease. Once it started in Colorado, there was no mechanism to stop it. And so as a hunter, I thought, well, we need to get ahead of this. And I thought, well, maybe gray wolf reintroduction is the way to do that because it seems to have been so successful in the Northern Rockies. Why don't we do that down here? And it was probably, a year or two later, I guess it was 2019, I was having dinner with a friend. He works in politics, and he said to me, hey, I'm working on this ballot initiative to restore gray wolves to Colorado. And I said, well, as a hunter, I said, sign me up, because I think we need a lot of gray wolves in Colorado if we're going to turn this around. And right now, John, 82% of our deer herds have some level of chronic wasting disease. 40% of our elk herds do. And every year it gets worse. And if we don't get, a lot more mountain lions and a lot more wolves on this landscape, killing diseased elk and deer, we're not going to turn it around. And by the end of the century, those herds will have collapsed and just disappeared because chronic wasting disease is always fatal.
And I was reading these numbers too, and you said so many things in there. First of all, that black wolf encounter, wow, 11,000 feet killing and bringing that elk down, it's very impressive. I mean, before we get into numbers and things like that, I go back to this because Stephen and I have had these conversations both on this podcast in person and really trying to bring sides together. Where do you believe as a hunter, or where have you seen maybe sort of this disconnect, or maybe not necessarily disconnect, but not wanting to follow through on sort of the ethics that you spoke about early on? When I think there's a lot of, I spoke about the North American model for conservation with, the likes of Dave Stalling and Carter Niemeyer, and sort of the pieces in there that don't necessarily bode well for vast biodiversity or for certain different things because it was a different time. And now where we sit now in 2026, things have changed even more drastically in one way or the other. So where is the lack of follow through coming from when we talk about not just the conservation aspect of it, but the hunting community aspect, and not working together to see the things that you're seeing and looking at these numbers and realizing there is an ecosystem break. There is a problem balance-wise, biodiversity-wise, that's just not being held. So instead of just, and again, this is not painting a broad brush on all hunters or all conservationists and things like that, why is there not more of a collective sense of urgency in making sure that there's a follow-through to say, hey, these things need to be addressed?
That's a great question. I think the problem is really a cultural one, John. Just my experience as a hunter and being in part of that community, we have certain beliefs that we've grown up with. And part of those beliefs are, you kill all your predators because you see predators as competition for the resource that you want to hunt, right? And I think we miss the more complicated, more nuanced connections within nature, which is, well, if you remove predators from an ecosystem, you fundamentally change that balance and you create all sorts of problems in that ecosystem that maybe you're not thinking about initially when you're saying to yourself, boy, if there were less wolves there, it'd be easier for me to kill elk because there'd be more elk. Now, the irony is it's really worked out the opposite way because of chronic wasting disease. We're now losing elk on the landscape and we're losing deer on the landscape. In fact, in Colorado, there are some deer herds here that have a prevalence rate of over 25% of chronic wasting disease. And CPW can't even achieve the target populations they have for those deer because of chronic wasting disease. But these aren't things that most hunters, I think, have kind of grappled with. I was lucky in the sense that I got a master's degree in ecology. And that has kind of informed the way I think about these things. And there are plenty of other hunters now that do that. But if you look at the leaderships of a lot of these hunting organizations, they tend to respond to kind of the lowest common denominator within that community or within that organization. And it tends to be just focused on consumption. How can I more easily shoot a deer next year? How can I more easily shoot an elk next year? Rather than thinking long-term, man, we got this incredible resource out here. How do we make sure that the ecosystem that supports that resource is healthy and that resource itself is disease-free? It's just a different way of thinking if you're a hunter. And it's tough to turn culture around. It's like climate change. That half the country thinks, or a third of the country thinks, that climate change is a hoax, and so we can't do anything about it. And how do we change that mindset so that people recognize from a science standpoint that climate change is real and it's something we all need to come to grips with and start to change our lifestyle to address?
And you bring up some very interesting issues that we have, obviously, is that I do tend to side with the fact that there is information that's readily available, I think, for those that want to look for it. So I guess my query always is, if we see these things, and I genuinely do believe those that are out in the ecosystems, out in the wilds, that are, whether you're hunting, hiking, conservation, though there is something to be said for those that spend more time in the outdoors than probably the average human being that lives in an urban center. And you're able to see things or record things that most others don't see, listen, view, whatever it may be. So there is a knowledge there. Where and why, if yourself and others are able to acquire this information and see that these, like you said, CWD is the biggest example of this, of the breakdown of herds, or like you said, if herds are not able to achieve their population goals, we have a different set of problems. Obviously, climate impacting that, large snow falls, crushing herds. Now we have a water issue, which we'll get to with this March heat that's coming through. How is information not getting into these places? Is it, like you said, is it really just as simple as a cultural disconnect and not wanting to put that information out there because it hits against the cause, or is it because that information is not readily available or not put in terms that most folks can understand? I know that was a lot, but
yeah. No, John, I think the answer is probably all of the above. For a lot of it, for me, like, I managed the Wolf Restoration Ballot Initiative in 2020. And in doing that, I worked with a lot of groups, Sierra Club, a group that emerged out of that, Colorado Nature League, Rocky Mountain Wolf Project. And they tend to sit on the left side of the divide, the cultural divide, right? And when hunters look at them, they kind of say to themselves, well, these are a bunch of godless communists. Why would I listen to them? And they discount that information. They kind of, I don't think what they're telling me is the truth. And unfortunately, unless you're open to information, it's like all of us who self-select, whether it's Fox News or CNN. We select the information that we allow ourselves to consume. And I think the hunting community has been guilty of self-censoring themselves or self-censoring themselves in the sense that they won't accept information that comes from a source other than them. And in the hunting community, because it has these strongly held cultural beliefs about wolves and mountain lions and so forth, and the fact that they're competing with us, they don't really allow information in that contradicts that basic cultural tenet. And I think that that's a problem. And I think it's slowly going to change, because as more and more hunters look and see what's happening on the ground with chronic wasting disease, and they follow those trends out into the future, and they know what's going to happen to those elk and deer herds, they're going to be forced to confront the reality of it. Just like on climate change, as we look at the Earth heating up and sea level rising and so forth, climate deniers are going to slowly have to confront that. But it's almost going to have to be a generational thing. I think older white men are probably least able to accept new information. And I think that generation is going to have to move on, frankly, and allow other generations to come up that might be more open to information, both on the biodiversity crisis, what we need to do about that, what we need to do about climate change, chronic wasting disease, all these things that are so important to, maintaining a balanced ecosystem, on our planet.
When you said something, it was in one of the articles, and forgive me if I can't remember what exactly it is, but you mentioned I believe you have two sons, and you were talking about how I think I don't know, do you have two sons? I can't remember. I don't want to, yeah, two sons. And you were explaining that I think they had just shot their first, I don't know if it was an elk or a deer, whatever it is. And you were talking about passing on when I hand my, when my traditions or whatever get handed down to my sons, odds are my guns or my hunting licenses probably won't be used as much, because they're not brought up in that generation to do those things. So is there a possibility that the generations coming up now, even in, like yourself, you have two sons, could they be the avenue into this area? And again, everything's up for, debate or possibility or skepticism. But what do you think would take? What would it take to have that kind of information disseminated into groups like this, or to sort of just change course? Not necessarily we're not looking, I think, or anybody's looking to destroy or get rid of, hunting, fishing, any of those things altogether. But it's almost a course corrective. How do we, adapt into these new and changing times? What do you think it would take to do that, if you have an idea?
No, it's interesting, John. So the piece that you're referring to, I wrote just a week or two ago in response to an episode that happened with our State Wildlife Commission, just a month ago. And the Colorado Parks and Wildlife, which is our state wildlife agency, had proposed daily bag limits for hunting 17 different fur bears, including beaver, of 15 per day. So per person, right? So that's 450 per person per month. And that's over 5,000 per person per year, okay? So the commission looked at that and said, that's crazy. Why would we allow, one individual to take 15 of each of these species per day? And so they got together and they went back to the staff and they said, these are way too high. Come back to us with more rational limits on hunting these fur bearers. And the next day or two, the Colorado press went crazy and they said, is this the end of hunting in Colorado? That the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission would challenge these limits, these incredibly high limits that were developed by staff. And so I looked at this and I thought, well, I'm glad they challenged that. If under the rules for beaver killing, 15 a day, 20 hunters could kill every beaver in Colorado in 6 months. Think about that. Why would you have a limit like that? It just makes no sense. So I wrote that piece and said, the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission challenging these really high limits is not going to be what kills hunting in Colorado. What's going to kill hunting in Colorado are basically three things. One is chronic wasting disease is ultimately going to kill our elk and deer herds, and they're going to disappear. Number two is we're not going to do enough to recover our threatened and endangered species, so we're not going to have healthy, functioning, resilient ecosystems that can support hunting. And third, it's the generational argument that you and I are talking about now, which is I have two boys. They're now 20 and 23, but when I was raising them here in Steamboat, I took them out. They got their hunter safety training. They both shot deer. One of them shot an elk. They've caught trout. But I said, look, I'm not naive enough to think that when they inherit my shotguns and rifles and fishing rods, that those are going to see much use, because my boys, unfortunately, like everyone else's kids, grew up on Instagram and video games and Snapchat, and that's their world, right? So they don't have that connection to nature that I do, even though I try to instill some of that in them. So I don't expect them to carry on my traditions, which I'm a little sad about. But on the other hand, they have, my oldest son majored in, environmental science. And he cares deeply about the environment. And I think he has really strong ethics about what we should do to protect our environment, to recover endangered species, to have healthy ecosystems. And so it gives me a lot of hope that generation is thinking in those terms. And I see a lot of his peers thinking in the same way, taking the same majors, worrying about the environment. And I think that's great.
Yeah, you need to have that broad ecological perspective now. And I think it's so interesting. I was talking to Kim Bean just the other day, and she shares the story with me every once in a while that, sometimes we have groups or folks that are focused on, say, one singular animal. It could be the wolf, it could be the whale, whatever it is. And in context, we really need to be focused about the larger macro view about what's exactly happening. And this really transitions really quite seamlessly to the piece that really caught my attention that you spoke about, was the future of winter water and wildlife in Colorado. And this is a microcosm, but I really do believe this draws parallel to whether you want to call it national or even global biodiversity and crises that we're seeing. And yeah, it does seem that the younger generation, even below me, is very much in tune with things that are happening in our oceans, things that are happening on the ground, literally on the ground, in the air, and all those pollutants. You mentioned just before about the fur-bearing issue, and we'll get into the beaver discussion in just a moment. But I pulled some of those numbers that you had in that article. 45% of the species in the state, and we're just strictly talking about Colorado here because Eric lives there and this is his wheelhouse. 45% of the species in the state merit listing in the State Wildlife Action Plan, in the SWAP. So almost half of the 1,400 species merit that. You went into CWD. I mean, these are things that are generally concerning when you think about that. And it trickles down, I think, economically. You talk about that a little bit too. I think these are things that maybe people don't see the correlation of, I guess, the monies that come in, for hunting and fishing. Obviously, we've talked with other folks in Rocky Mountain Wolf about, hey, is there a way to switch, hunting into wildlife guiding or wildlife photography, things like that. But just, I think, since we're in the hunting discussion still, talk about the collapse of what could possibly happen should CWD get to the levels and surpass the levels of what you're even talking about. Because what you had in your article, 82% of deer and 40% of elk herds infected with some measure of CWD. Those are alarming numbers. So when herds collapse, that revenue is gone, correct?
Oh yeah, no, it's really terrifying. It's terrifying ecologically, but it's terrifying economically. If you look at Colorado, so much of our state wildlife agency is funded by the sale of deer and elk licenses to out-of-state hunters. They pay about 10 or 15 times more than I do as an in-state hunter. So that really funds the agency. But out-of-state hunting also funds hotels, car rentals, restaurants, guides. I mean, it's so just hunting alone is $1 billion industry in Colorado. If you combine that with fishing, it's a $3 billion industry. And all of that could go away in the next 50 years. Our cold water fisheries for trout, if you think about cold water fisheries warming up, climate change, less and less snowpack, rivers, streams running dry by, July, August, our cold water fisheries are in deep, deep trouble. Our elk and deer are in deep, deep trouble because of chronic wasting disease. And all of the businesses in Colorado that rely on that $3 billion a year industry are going to start to suffer. As chronic wasting disease grows and grows and becomes more understood, you're going to have fewer and fewer hunters wanting to come into Colorado to hunt deer and elk because the chances of them shooting an infected deer or elk are getting higher every day. So it's a really kind of a terrifying, sad future we're looking at here.
Just because we're sitting in, and obviously when this is being recorded is, as I said at the top, is when we've had this crazy March heat wave at this point, like I said, sort of encasing the West, from California through Colorado a little bit here. Describe what that impact is, because Colorado not having the snowpack or the water, just the water in general, not having there is going to pose obviously different challenges as we get into the summer months. What just talk about that effect there, just in this week to 2 week span, where this is supposed to be some of the higher dumping of moisture, rain, snow, snowpack, things like that. And those things are nearly non-existent at this point at the end of the month.
Yeah, no, it's and I probably use this word too much. It's terrifying. It's terrifying as much as anything from a fire standpoint. Like I live, 10 miles or 10 minutes south of Steamboat Springs, Colorado, in the mountains, 7,500 feet, surrounded by forest. And I spent my weekend with my chainsaw, cutting down trees around my house, expecting that this summer is a very good chance that we're going to have a big wildfire blow through here. So the wildfire issues are ever present in the minds of Coloradans. Agriculture stands to lose a lot. They use 90% of the water in the state. And I think you're going to see irrigation ditches running dry probably by July this year, whereas they typically run through October. Cold water fisheries are going to suffer by July. You're going to have presumably a very hot summer, very low flows in the rivers. Dissolved oxygen is going to be, very low, and you're going to see trout literally dying in the rivers. And then you add on top of that, you're going to see restrictions on people watering their lawns and so forth. Water is the conversation that every Coloradan has all the time. But when we get to this type of a year with the heat we're seeing, with the lack of snow we're seeing, it's an omnipresent dread that infects the way people think about their lives in the state. And we had, I live in a town with a ski resort. Typically, we get at least 300 inches of snow this year. This year, we had 155. So, and right now, it was 82 degrees yesterday in Steamboat, which is unheard of. We're breaking records now. All that snow is melting off. It's going to be gone soon. We don't have a lot of storage in the state. We have some reservoirs, but typically we rely on snowpack as our source of storage. And that melts off slowly during the summer so that by July, August, we still have water running in the streams. That's not going to happen this year. This low snowpack is going to melt off way too soon. So, yeah, we're bracing for a really difficult next 6 months.
The Wolf Connection podcast is now sponsored by our new partner, Jacques-Marie Mage. This LA-based brand is known for their limited edition, handcrafted eyewear and luxury goods, but also for their stewardship program, which supports various nonprofits and individuals who are working to protect a future for wild wolves.
I mean, these are things that, and we're getting sort of into, the solution aspect of, or how can we have the solutions? And I know I'm bouncing back and forth between different things, and we'll stick with this for just a minute. Now, I do want to go back to sort of the species and the biodiversity issues we're having. What are some things that we can look at, though? Obviously, this is impacting the overall. You saw how this is going to impact the overall ecosystem within the state, impact the businesses, impact the agricultural things like that. If we sit on this for just a second, what are some ways to sort of redirect? And I know I'm bouncing around here and getting sort of the solution part before we get through everything, but what are ways? And you talked about this too in that same article. How do we change or shift our focus in terms of, in just this particular issue with climate, to supply either, CPW or CWP, CPW, sorry, it's Colorado Parks and Wildlife, or these other interests to combat when there is low snowpack, when there is less moisture? What are things that people aren't seeing if we pull out to the global view or the state view of itself that we can help mitigate these climate mitigation systems that are now starting to happen more frequently?
Yeah, thanks, John. It's, to me, the obvious one is beavers. Mm-hmm. And it's a little bit like wolves, employing wolves to get rid of or curtail the spread of chronic wasting disease. We can employ beavers to build dams and store enormous amounts of water on the landscape. Colorado State University in 2022 released a study that showed that we have the ability to host 1.36 million beaver dams in Colorado. Now, each beaver dam on average holds 1 acre foot of water, which is 325,000 gallons of water. So if you do the math, if we populated all those areas that we could with beaver dams, we would store 450 billion with a B billion gallons of water on the Colorado landscape that we're not storing today. Because today we only have 53,000 beavers. It's a tiny, tiny fraction of what we could have. And it's because we killed so many beavers every year that we haven't grown our beaver population at all since 1941. So it's a mindset that we have to change. And the irony is it tends to be more conservative, folks in so-called West Slope, Colorado, who are so used to killing beavers. If a beaver floods your ranch or whatever, you get out your gun and you shoot that beaver. Beavers now need to be looked at as the savior of our water problems. 450 billion gallons, to put it in perspective, is 1/4 of all the water we use in Colorado in a year. So it would make a huge difference in terms of our ability to store water and our ability to have water flowing in streams and available for all sorts of uses, including agriculture and human consumption in August, September, October. But we need to change our mindset and think of beaver as an asset rather than as a problem we need to solve with a rifle.
I mean, beavers, to many, biologists and scientists' point, is they are, when we talk about Yellowstone, beavers are, if they're not one, they're 1A with wolves once they got reintroduced. I mean, beavers are, I believe they're classified as a keystone species. What is it? What is the, I guess, for a quick history lesson, is it simply because beavers are looked at as vermin or pest in that way? Since, almost a century ago now, as we look at, if we go back in time, where can we sort of interject and sort of look at sort of the biological issue here, like you just pointed out so well, for people to realize, hey, beavers are our friends, and they're the ones that are going to help you with, these agricultural issues and things like that. Is it truly just simply mindset and nothing else? Or again, is there information that's just not getting, pushed out to the places that need it?
Yeah, I mean, again, I feel like an echo chamber here, but it comes back to culture. So, in the early 1800s, the trappers came through and they cleaned out most of our beaver. And I think that kind of started this mindset that beaver have no value other than their fur. And so, every time a private landowner, gets a beaver family moving in and creates a dam that floods, the solution is let's just shoot it because that beaver has no value and it's a pest. And I think that's true for a lot of the species. In fact, up until a month ago, the limit for beavers was unlimited. Any person could kill as many beavers as they wanted to, all year long. There's in fact, I think it's written into the Colorado Constitution, the right to shoot your beavers in an unlimited way. So we need to change that somehow. And, there's been some wonderful work done. There's a guy named Ben Goldfarb who wrote this incredible book called Eager. And he's been great. He goes around the country. He came to Steamboat. He spent a couple hours talking to an audience, a rapt audience of, why we should have more beavers on the landscape. So there is some of that that's getting through. But, most people are worried about paying the rent and, going to work, and they don't have time. And I get it, right? They don't have time to read Ben Goldfarb's book. So they don't think about beavers. And I don't have the special magical answer to change that, other than it's going to be a slow process. Hopefully our state legislators can help. Hopefully Colorado Parks and Wildlife can help. I know our governor has been great about that. He talks about the importance of beavers. And slowly it's sinking in. In fact, in an hour from now, I'm going to go testify at the State House on a bill to conserve our beavers, and hoping that'll pass. So more and more we're having that conversation. But again, it's like turning around a battleship when the culture for 200 years has said, shoot your beavers because they have no value.
Yeah. And look, and the other things that you mentioned to me too, or that you said in that article, that the positives for beavers, creating fire breaks, improving trout and songbird habitat. So it's really this impressive domino effect that beavers have, not just on storing water, which is the big caveat to all this, but all these other little things as well. When we shift to predators and we talk about the CWD issue, and we've had this conversation multiple times, it does just seem it's about sort of, like you said, turning this battleship very, very slowly. As this state, as Colorado deals with CWD or the entrance of CWD into these populations, and trying to figure out, obviously we've had this reintroduction of wolves in Colorado for the past 2 years, and then they didn't reintroduce anymore this year. There just seems to be an impasse on, I guess, letting predators do what they need to do to balance out these herds. And I just, Stephen and I sort of butt up against, our own ideas about like how are we not noticing this by now, that they can be an ally. Predators can be an ally in this situation of creating stronger herds, creating stronger elk, creating stronger deer, whatever ungulate it may be, and truly weeding out these disease issues. Maybe not 100%, because let's face it, wolves are not, they're not efficient in terms of, getting an elk every time. But boy, it could really, truly change the landscape in a positive way for those that look at this. I guess it's the same broken record, right? It's like, how do we change culture? Are there any bills or things as we look at the reintroduction of wolves in Colorado, and it's sort of hit a stalemate on some level? Where is the impasse happening? Is it just because of large payouts for cattle depredations, which seem exorbitant? For only, I believe it was when we had the first 2 reintroductions, we had maybe 20 some odd wolves in the state. Now I think there's only 14 or so of the ones that have been reintroduced that are there. So what's happening on that front, if you can shed any light on that and why that's taking a turn?
So we don't exactly know how many wolves we've got right now. I'd say there's probably mid-30s maybe.
Mid-30s? Okay.
Yeah, because of those that came in, they've had pups, and we're going to have another round of pups this spring. I think the biggest issue is probably coexistence. I think one of the things that we collectively in Colorado failed to do was get out in front of that issue before the December 2023 wolf releases, and really work with the ranching community and demonstrate to them, hey, this stuff works. We've seen it work in Montana and Idaho and Wyoming. It's going to work for you too. I think that they were kind of in denial a little bit about wolves. They had been told during the campaign that wolves are going to give them coronavirus, tapeworm, eat their children. I mean, the myths that we were trying to cut through there, I think, just because they were coming from conservative sources, were believed. And so we're constantly trying to, backfill and say, look, that's none of that's true. Not only are they not going to give you tapeworm or coronavirus, they're not going to eat your children, and they won't eat your livestock if you do these things. And I would say that now, probably 99% of the ranchers in Colorado, I think, are really responsible. They're conscientious. They're working with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. They're doing their vulnerability assessments. They're managing their carcass pits. They're deploying their non-lethals. But there's still like 1% that want the system to fail so they can justify shooting wolves. And so and then the Colorado news media has been completely unhelpful, because they don't want to talk about the benefits of wolves. They want to talk about the wolf that killed the livestock that got the rancher mad, because that's the sexy story. And so we've struggled to break through that. And that's why I spend so much of my time writing op-eds, because that's literally the only way we can get that story out.
I mean, what's a way to shift, these systems in a way? Because obviously there's money. As we've seen, Rocky Mountain Wolf raise all that license plate money to give to ranchers for depredations. They've had non-lethal methods there to really reduce the reliance on hunting or shooting and costing money in that way. So how do we shift this? Because you talked about wildlife education as one of your main points for really all the stuff that we've just discussed, and it really comes down to that. How can we shift or put money into ways that CPW or other organizations, governmental organizations in the state, are able to put this stuff over into the right hands, so that everybody who's working on the landscape, having a relationship with the landscape, and then looking to recreate on there, has everything they need, so that science-based actions are there. It's not about interest group policy, and just making sure, like you said, that coexistence sort of reigns supreme in the end, to make all these things happen.
Yeah, and it's great that, Rocky Mountain Wolf Project, raising the money they're raising through the license plate has been fantastic. The legislature's provided some money. Groups like Western Landowners Alliance out here has raised money.
Yeah, they're a good organization. Yep.
Yeah, from USDA. So, it's going to take time. It's going to take a certain amount of patience, but it feels like real progress is being made now. That ranchers who want the coexistence tools are getting not only the technical assistance, but the financial assistance. CPW's got a more robust range rider program that they're putting on the ground, which I think is comforting to people to know that if you see a wolf near your ranch, you can call, there's a number to call and you can get a range rider to come out and tackle that problem. It's never going to be perfect. We're dealing with a natural system. You're never going to prevent all depredations. But Colorado does have the most generous compensation program probably in the world for wolf depredation. So hopefully that will reassure ranchers that they're not going to lose economically by coexisting with wolves on the landscape. But it's going to take time. I mean, I talked to friends of mine, who were involved in the wolf reintroductions in the Northern Rockies, guys like Mike Phillips, who led that, for the Fish and Wildlife Service in '95 in Yellowstone. And there's this arc of understanding, I guess. It just takes time. You go through kind of the stages of grief, right? Denial and unhappiness, and then eventually acceptance. And I think if you look at the polling that's been done in Montana, for example, over 70% of the Montanans now accept wolves, and don't have a problem with them. I bet if you took that poll 25 years ago, it would be like 10%, right? So if you live with wolves, you see the reality of it, you learn about that. Acceptance is the final stage. We're in the very early stages here in Colorado. I think we're maybe we can see the end of the beginning. The beginning being the first two or 3 years where there was a lot of anxiety. Understandably, people didn't know what was going to happen. They feared the worst. I think they're realizing that the worst isn't going to happen, that we can coexist with wolves. But it just takes time for that to permeate through the community, through the population, through the media, before people can kind of relax a little bit and say, okay, yeah, this is fine. It's not going to be a problem.
And it seems like it's a simple act. I know it's not simple, and I'm sure somebody will look at this or that. But it's like when we look at things from the outside, because I think when folks get on the inside of whatever issue it may be, whether it's beavers or water or trees or forests and things like that, we're in the weeds, no pun intended, for what we're collectively doing. And if we look at the larger picture here and we say, boy, if we allow situations for the wild to regenerate itself, for biodiversity to take over, and for these ecosystems to be restored in balance in a way that humans can coexist with it, we, by all measures, seem like we could be better off for it and allowing those natural processes to take over. And it's almost as though, and I can't remember who I spoke about with this last, that we're really trying to rein in some of the things that we've done prior, and it gets very messy on that way to try and fix those things. So, I mean, I know, look, you and I have spoken about a lot of, some would say a little bit of doom and gloom, but these are the reality of what's happening right now, obviously with the climate, things that are happening in the state of Colorado right now. Give me, as I know you're crunched for time a little bit, but I want to know if there's one or two things maybe that we didn't necessarily touch on all the way through, or something that you want to bring up here before we exit out of this. But you let me know if there's something that we can dive into a little bit more, or something else you want to say prior to us, sort of signing off on this. But I think it's really been important for people to know the numbers and the issues and the things that are happening in real time, what's going on in Colorado.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think the key for me is just, how do we convince, I guess it's really the news media generally, to be able to talk about this in a nuanced and thoughtful way. Because again, their instincts are, and we saw that out here, in fact, from the inception of the campaign in 2019, people, they want to talk about the sexy drama. They don't want to talk about, why beavers might be helpful. They want to talk about the guy that's pissed off at the beaver and shot the beaver, or the wolf, or whatever. So this is why, I love the fact that you're doing this podcast. I appreciate the fact that I have a chance to publish these op-eds. But at the same time, I don't feel like I'm reaching a ton of people with op-eds. Like, how do we change the way that people consume information, and whether that's the mainstream media or podcasts or social media, in a way that they get really good information so they understand sort of the scientific basis of reality, climate change, biodiversity, what this means, chronic wasting disease in our elk and deer, why wolves are good, why beavers are good. I think people are open to consuming that information, or at least I would say 70% of the people are open to consuming that information, but they need to get it in front of them in an easily consumable way. And I think right now that's one of our biggest challenges. And I feel like a guy writing his op-eds, trying to keep back the ocean with a broom. It's just it's kind of impossible. But the more you do it, and I think here in Colorado, particularly because we're now a pretty blue state. People who've moved in here who love nature, who want to get out in nature, who want to protect nature. They aren't consuming wildlife the way that hunters do, the way I do. They're consuming it through cameras, and experience. And I think they're very open to that message. But at the same time, they're paying $4 for gasoline and, trying to find a place to buy a house that they can afford. And it's tough to break through that.
Yeah, it's this always seems like it's the conversation that it's tough to bring to the everyday person, because the everyday person, as you and I are, it's the same. Everybody has challenges, and what they're going through. Everybody's lives are different. And I think as we try to do our part with this podcast, is just bringing sort of those larger ecological issues to the forefront. And, the wolf is the driver, the lion is the driver, the beaver, the ancient forest, whatever it may be, whatever the topic that we talk about with these guests, it's really about looking at the natural environment as a way that it is one of those things that we should really bring our attention to. Because if we do restore, rebound, make these places, these wild places, healthy again, thriving again, we will see it will change ultimately the way that we go through the world. It'll go through at least our part of the world, and realize it all trickles down in a positive way for us. I guess, like you said, just keep pounding the pavement as much as you can to explain that, hey, we have solutions and natural solutions. And I think that's the big thing. There are natural ways to do this, to let nature take its course, and it could, help us out in that way. And yeah, that takes time. And I think part of our problems as humans is that we want that quick answer, and sometimes it doesn't happen, and it takes years or possibly decades to do it. And some of us might feel like it's too late, and others feel like, hey, if we start now, we can get going in the right direction.
I think if nothing else, John, I think we can leave behind a little bit of a roadmap for the next generation that wants answers, it's open to doing this, whether it's rewilding or coexistence and that kind of thing. Even though we're doing it in a very imperfect and controversial way, I think they will embrace that, because it's going to depend. Their whole world's going to depend on getting that right. So hopefully some of the things that we're working on now will have long-term application.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else before I give you my last question, Eric? Anything that you want anybody to know who's listening to this, a place where they can go if they're listening and say, hey, I want to help with beaver restoration, I want to help with the Gray Wolf campaign, I want to help with water, what is it? Do you have any ideas or places where they can go that they can?
Well, I would just say there's a lot of great organizations working on that. I mean, you mentioned Rocky Mountain Wolf Program. They're fantastic. Join them, buy a wolf license plate and contribute to coexistence in Colorado. There's a coalition of progressive wildlife organizations in Colorado called the Colorado Nature League. They're working on beavers right now. They're working on bighorn sheep. They're working on using science in all wildlife management, decision-making. They're great. So there are places to go, organizations to join, and I would just say join one, join five, and give them your time and your treasure.
Awesome. Eric, my last question for you is, when you hear the word wolf, what's the thing that comes to your mind?
I guess I would say wilderness, wildness, and hope. Hope that we can rebalance these ecosystems, hope that we can deal with the chronic wasting disease and get these elk and deer and moose herds healthy again. It's an embodiment of nature for me.
Yeah. I mean, look, your perspective has been great. I appreciate your candor and going down, some of your personal history and really laying out hopefully a roadmap and some of the things we need to be aware of what's going on in your state in Colorado, because it's such a beautiful place. And I think there are folks out there that really want to help this and see this place not go to the wayside for something that maybe we could do. So Eric Washburn, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for all of your information. And, like I said, your experience is invaluable. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, John. It was a pleasure. I really appreciate the chance to be on your podcast.
Absolutely. Just hang tight while I sign off here. How's to you all out there? We'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody.
Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer. Thank you for listening.